Okay, it's 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. So this is the August meeting of our DNA interest group. And this meeting today is going to be part of a two-part series. And so this month and next month, I've titled Family History Revealed. And so what we're going to focus on today is sort of searching for family using commercial DNA testing as a platform to do that search. We're lucky to have Ho Tran with us tonight to talk about his search. I'll introduce him in a second. I'm Brent McAllister. So we have this DNA interest group meeting, and as I said, September we'll talk about the finding part of Family History Revealed, and so being on the finding end of discovering new relatives. October will be identifying and predicting relationships, and then November will be a doggy DNA, and so commercial DNA testing related to your canine pet. And so here's our schedule for the next few months. And so as a reminder, the fourth Tuesday of each month is the DNA interest group, 6 to 7 p.m. right here. So this two-part series about Family History Revealed is really about using commercial DNA testing as a service to match an individual with relatives. And so one feature of many different commercial DNA platforms is that you send in your sample, they take DNA from your saliva sample that you send, and then they match you with others in their database. And so that's one of the features that's provided by these different testing companies. And so you get this long list of relatives that are identified by tests that you would do by Ancestry DNA, by 23andMe, by Family Tree DNA, by MyHeritage DNA. That relative matching feature is essentially taking your sample and matching you based on your genetic information with others in the database, predicting that this is a first cousin or this is a third cousin, and you get this long list of individuals that are organized by relationship that's predicted to be with you. And so I've taken this little quote from the MyHeritage DNA website. After years of searching for my biological father and with no name to research, I finally found him with my MyHeritage DNA match. And so here's one example, MyHeritage sort of promoting this as a way to do this search of using commercial DNA testing to do that. And so each of these is taking your sample, comparing within their database. Family Tree DNA will take data available from other services, and you can incorporate that into their database and search on their database. There are also some other websites out there where you can take DNA from each of these services and search on the collective database of individuals that have input their DNA into DNA Land is one of these. GEDmatch is another one of these services where you can do that search. All of this is based on genetics, in that if you have a common ancestor with others, due to the way that DNA is inherited from generation to generation, that if you have close relatives descended from this common ancestor, you're going to have these regions of identity that you share between other individuals that share that ancestor if you look within a few generations. And so this is the nature of inheritance of DNA molecules that's present in our chromosomes, is that we have sort of this diminishing amount of genetic identity that we share with close relatives. And so in this case, what we have is this one chromosome, this one piece of DNA here from this man. These siblings have this little bit of matching region here on that chromosome. Their children have a little bit of matching region on that chromosome, and that matching identical region is what these commercial DNA platforms are using to find relatives and also predict the relationships among individuals within their database. This just shows us one chromosome tracing down, and eventually you can lose that identity simply due to the nature of transmission of genetic information. We do have 22 pairs of chromosomes, and so that gives us some opportunity beyond the single chromosome within the single pair. That gives us some opportunity to find cousins out to second, third, fourth, sort of really declining at the fifth cousin level and beyond in terms of having any evidence of having a common ancestor whenever you're looking at that level. I'll just sort of tell you a little bit of my own story and sort of searching, not necessarily searching, but we already had the hypothesis within our family. Some of you may have already heard this story before, but it sort of fits for this in terms of how you can use these services. And so my father, we used to go to family reunions. He has a brother. He has 3 sisters. We oftentimes had Melvin, Uncle Melvin, that would show up. There was always sort of rumors that Uncle Melvin was also a sibling of those 5 children of my grandfather. Uncle Melvin looked a lot like my dad and my dad's brother. And so there was this story that Uncle Melvin was actually truly Uncle Melvin by a different grandmother than mine. And so we had this family history, or this family story, that my grandfather had a child by another woman. By the time this commercial DNA testing came around, Uncle Melvin had deceased, and so he was no longer available to take the test. However, he's had several children. One of his children still shows up at family reunions. He's part of the family based on the story. And so I said, hey, you want to put it to the test? And so in this case, it wasn't necessarily searching to find. It was a case we had a hypothesis that my grandfather had this child by another woman. I wanted to check my half-first cousin, presumably based on the hypothesis, to see if that would be supported. Sure enough, here's my sample, here's his sample. Here are those segments of identity that we share because we do have this common grandfather. And so that common ancestor, we have a bit of our chromosome 1, a bit of our chromosome 2, a little bit of our 3, a little bit of our 4. We have in total 10 different long regions of our 22 chromosome pairs that we share that presumably were inherited from our common grandfather. Genetics, we can make a prediction of what that would be, and so 6.25% of our genome should be identical, and 23andMe is the service shown here. What they observe is 6.35% of our DNA is shared. And so I think the family history, the story there is supported in this case in terms of the searching. I'll follow this up a little bit next month in terms of the finding, because there's some more wrinkles in this story that have arisen based on my half-first cousin that has agreed to do this testing of our family history. And so that's on the finding end. So I'll start off with that next time. There's this news story that recently came out as well. And in this case, this appears to be sort of a hypothetical on solving a murder mystery with Ancestry websites. And so this story was about a police department that had a cold case, and in this particular story, they do not know the identity of the victim. They've never been able to trace the identity of the victim. They do have DNA from this victim, and so this story is about the possibility of doing that searching to ultimately find relatives in these databases, using that victim's DNA to ultimately find living relatives to potentially help identify who that victim of this murder was. And so this is an interesting case of potentially, in a cold case, not necessarily solving the crime, but actually solving the identity of the victim of the crime in terms of using these websites. Ancestry DNA now has 5 million customers in their database. There's a lot of opportunity to find relatives whenever you have a DNA sample in a cold case or as an individual searching for relatives. 23andMe has 2 million individuals within their database, and so there's lots of possibility in terms of making those connections. So that's a little bit of introduction in terms of the background, and in case you're not familiar with commercial DNA testing and the one feature that we're focused on for this month and next month, and that's that DNA relatives feature. We have a guest speaker tonight, and so Tony Tran emailed me back in fall of last year. There was a story, I think it's on Iowa Alumni Magazine. There was a story on my first year seminar class that went out in Iowa Alumni Magazine that actually precipitated 2 emails. One of these was from Tony on, wow, I wish that seminar class was offered whenever I was a student at Iowa, because I'm doing what your students are doing. I have a blog, I read his blog, and so that's how I got to know Tony. I thought he really fit into this evening very well, and he graciously agreed to come over and share his story with us tonight. So he's a 2014 grad of the University of Iowa with an English degree, creative writing. He's now working in Chicago as a professional writer for a startup company in California. He keeps a blog. So Saigon to Sioux City is a blog. It's linked to the event from tonight's meeting on Facebook, and it's also linked on the Genetics for Genealogy website as well. And so some really nice write-ups on his blog in terms of his story. But he's here tonight to tell us about his story of becoming an amateur genetic genealogist. And so using genetics, commercial genetic platforms to search for his history, and I'll let him tell you about his history. What I would like you to do is to let him tell his story. About 20, 30 minutes, he's going to tell his story, and then I'll lead a discussion afterwards. And so if you have questions, please hold them until after he's done telling his story. And so please welcome Tony Tran.
The lights are going on? Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? When they gave me this, they asked me if I was a mover or a stander, and I didn't know how to answer that question. So if I start moving outside, someone should go get me. I'd like to thank Professor Brian McAllister for inviting me up here. Also, the biology department and the DNA interest group for facilitating everything for me. So thank you very much. So dying is my greatest fear. And I understand that's a little bit ironic for, oh, I'm a mover, look at that. And I understand that might be a little bit ironic for anyone who knows me and knows my penchant for getting into bodily harm by, say, running with the bulls or staring directly into a solar eclipse. But it's true. I'm very afraid of dying. And there's actually a quote that I read a number of years ago that's really stuck by me because it really hit home that sort of fear for me. Everybody dies twice. First, when your heart stops beating, and second, when someone says your name for the last time. What that quote is referring to is a concept called the second death. And it's weird, because despite everything that you might do now, despite everything that you are and everything that is so uniquely you, one day we're all going to end up in the same way, just 6 feet under a layer of astroturf. And that quote is actually the reason that I bought the test kit from 23andMe. It's the reason why I'm standing in front of you today. And it's the reason why I reached out to my grandmother last year with a tape recorder and a list of questions. I've only ever had one grandparent, and I know, everyone has technically 4 grandparents, but I've only ever known one, my Bawai. Since my parents were often busy managing a restaurant when I was little, my grandmother practically raised my brother and I during the summers and weekends when we didn't have school. I remember long days sitting on her couch, watching The Price is Right with her, eating 2 greasy fried rice with the smell of fish sauce stinging my nostrils. And if we hadn't seen each other in a few days, she would always do this one thing. She would walk up to me, and she would excitedly grab my arm and peer up to me through her like Coke bottle glasses, and she would exclaim, "You look so much like him." This was often followed by her hugging me and then giggling like she was a young woman again. The him that she's referring to is, of course, my grandfather, my own Y, my mom's dad. And before I tell you about him, I want to tell you the biggest thing that I've learned in my research so far. It's that genealogy is goddamn messy. If you ever decide to take part in Ancestry or genealogy, you're bound to discover and unearth some really surprising stuff and often scandalous facts about your family. And they might just curl your hair, because that's exactly what happened to me. According to her, he was an American soldier stationed in Da Nang at the height of the Vietnam War. Not only that, but he was also married and had 2 kids in the United States. That didn't stop him and my Bawai, though, from meeting during this time, falling in love, and starting a relationship that spanned the better part of a decade, even though they didn't even speak the same language. This eventually culminated in my Bawai's pregnancy, the birth of a mixed-race child in 1966, a child who would go on to be my mother. Like I said, goddamn messy. Sadly, Mom didn't get to meet her dad. It was hard, my mom says to me, growing up without a father and also mixed race in Vietnam following the war. She was often bullied and ridiculed for her heritage. People would make fun of her, and they would call her things like "my lai," a Vietnamese word for a mixed-race child. The bullying got so bad that she actually chose to drop out of school at the age of 9. After all, she says, it was one thing to be mixed race. It was another thing entirely to be the child of an American soldier immediately after the war. That was practically a death sentence. This resulted in my mom growing some pretty thick skin when she was young, and she had to learn how to defend herself against the constant rain of just bullshit coming down on her. Eventually, my mom made it to America in her 20s. It was here that she met my father through a refugee program for people fleeing Vietnam. The two fell in love. They began a relationship that spanned the better part of 30 years, culminating in the birth of their first child in 1992, this handsome devil standing in front of you today. And while growing up in America, while mixed race wasn't nearly as bad as my mom's childhood, it did come with its own set of questions. What race am I? Why do I look the way I do? How come people keep on mistaking me for Bruno Mars? Questions that we didn't have the answers to because we didn't know one thing: who my grandfather was. Because despite their decade-long love affair, and despite bearing a child together, my Bawai can't accurately tell me his name because he was American and she just couldn't understand him. So in a way, my grandfather's second death had already occurred. And it's tragic. Not only was my mother deprived of father while she was growing up, but there's a man out there who knew he had a daughter, who loved her and would actually send her presents occasionally. And he has no idea what happened to her after the war. He's a man without an identity to me, but inadvertently contributed so much to forming mine. So 2 years ago, I decided to get started solving that 50-year-old question: who was this man? And that's when I bought the test kit from a company called 23andMe. Named for the 23 chromosomes in a typical human cell, 23andMe allows people to discover their ancestry and health background through saliva testing. The direct-to-consumer model looked really handy to me because they provided me everything I needed: a self-addressed envelope to send back the sample, test tube kits, like the whole shebang. And it was also nice because I didn't have to find a genetic scientist willing to look at my spit for $100, but I digress. The process was simple, as many of you know. Step 1, order the kit. Step 2, spit in the vial. Step 3, send it back. What wasn't simple, though, was the overwhelming feeling of anticipation I got as I waited for my results to get back. I mean, after all, this kit was my first step in solving a mystery that has plagued my family since my mom was born. It would help me finally find out what the hell race I was besides Vietnamese. And so, after many months, I finally got the notification that I had been waiting for. I remember like it was yesterday. I had gotten the notification on my phone in the middle of a work meeting, and I saw it, and I wanted nothing more than to just run out of that room to go find out what was going on. And I remember my heart was just beating against my ribs as I finally got to my office desk, and I pulled up the email notification, and I finally clicked and got my results. There they were, sitting right in front of me. The answers to a question that I just had all my life. And as it turns out, I am 72% East Asian, of course. on top of being 17% sub-Saharan African as well as 10% European. And my reaction could be summed up in 2 words: holy shit. I was giddy. There it was in front of me, the answers to questions I had all my life. I could barely contain my excitement, and I actually had to stand up and pace the floor for a little bit before going back to my computer. The results also confirmed a sneaking suspicion I had all my life, that my grandfather was probably black. I always had this feeling because based purely on the fact that the way my mom looked and also the way my grandmother would describe him as having dark skin and curly hair. However, I never would have guessed that he might also be mixed race as well, the product of both African and European ancestry. My grandfather probably looked as ethnically ambiguous as me, and to me that's pretty cool. Honestly, it's a really comforting thought knowing that my father knew what it was like to grow up mixed race, that we might have been cut by the same cloth, even though we don't even know each other's names. That every time I look into a mirror, I might be looking into a face that belonged to my grandfather. 23andMe also provided really in-depth results. Digging deeper into my ancestry composition, I discovered a few more interesting things. When it came to my African genes, my ancestors mostly came from West Africa, and that brought a metric butt ton of questions. You know, what part of Africa are they from? Is it possible I still have family there? Does that mean I was related to a slave? Where were they taking to? Are these racist questions? Can I be racist against my own race? Overall, I'm still left processing some of these questions. And my European ancestry revealed that my ancestors mainly came from the British Isles or other parts of northwestern Europe. And while the results were incredibly awesome, what was even cooler was the fact that the site provided me with a relative finder tool. And it helped me find my cousins. Cousins that I can connect with were broken down in 5 simple ways. First, immediate relatives, not really cousins. These are mothers, fathers, siblings, children, etc. First cousins, second cousins, third to fifth cousins, and fourth to distant cousin. The overwhelming majority of the DNA relatives fell under that fourth to distant cousin range, which is just their way of saying that there's a snowball chance in hell that I'll ever figure out how we're related. But it was still pretty awesome. It shows you things like whether or not relatives fall on your mom or dad's side of the family, how many DNA segments you match with them on, as well as their ancestry profile if they chose to share it. On top of showing you your possible relatives, you also have the option to message them and ask them to share things like their family tree info and the results of their ancestry test. So I started messaging around. I had a handful of third cousins and a single second cousin who would not message me back no matter how much I bothered him. But no one closer than that, so I knew I had to do a little bit of digging. So eventually I got an account with ancestry.com, which allowed me to build out my family tree, and I started researching the trees of the cousins. Many of them encouraged me to get my mom tested as well. Her results obviously would be closer to her dad. So I ordered a kit from Ancestry DNA, and she went through the fun process of spinning into a vial for strangers to look at too. Which brings me to the second biggest lesson I learned from genealogy. Everyone wants you to succeed. I don't think there was a single cousin I connected with who didn't want to find out exactly how we were related or help me find my grandfather's identity. The genealogy community is one of the purest, most supportive ones I've ever been a part of. I've talked for hours with 70-year-old cousins on the phone about their family lineage. I've been invited to family events and cookouts with relatives after just a few messages back and forth. These are people who know nothing else about me other than the fact that we're related and I'm trying to find my grandfather. And I honestly think that if you've ever lost hope in humanity, I urge you to take a genetic ancestry test. Because I promise you, you'll be floored by how kind some people can be. When my mom's results finally came in, we discovered the ancestry composition results were similar to my 23andMe results. The only difference was now that we had a new pool of cousins to connect with, including Michelle. Michelle was a second cousin match. Not only that, but she was also very active on the site. I reached out to her and I heard back from her within the day. I was ecstatic. Here was someone who I was relatively closely related to and was good about messaging back. It was a genealogist's dream. And she shared her family tree with me, answered my annoyingly persistent questions about her family background, and we stay connected now. However, after messaging back and forth, I soon realized that I was way in over my head when it came to the physical aspect of ancestry, the history, the digging through birth records, reading death certificates, deciphering terrible handwriting from hundreds of census workers. I knew I had to get more help, so I turned to the only person I knew who could help me, my girlfriend's mother, Liz Hazelton. I told Liz about my journey, and she bravely volunteered to help me. Liz has been doing ancestry work for years now. She has a lot of work under her belt. And she mostly does it just through good old-fashioned hustling, the census records, the government records, et cetera. If it exists, you can bet your ass Liz will be able to find it. And if she can't find it, and it just doesn't exist. So for a few weekends out of the year, I would make trips down from Chicago to her home in Geneva, where we'd shut ourselves in her home for a weekend and research Michelle's family tree while cross-referencing it with my other genetic matches. When it comes to researching, oftentimes genealogists will run into something called a wall. And a wall is the inability to progress any further in fleshing out a tree due to lack of records or just information out there. And that's exactly what happened with Michelle. At a certain point, we simply couldn't find one of the relatives going back a generation from her mom. So Liz gave me 2 pieces of advice. Step away from it for a while, and when you do, you might just discover new things with a fresh set of eyes when you go back to it. And number 2, that I should talk to my grandma. I thought I knew everything there was to know about my grandma, so I kind of poo-pooed at the suggestion, But Liz insisted on it, and eventually I found myself making plans to go back to Sioux City, Iowa to have a very frank discussion with her. I thought that I was going to go in there for like maybe 30 minutes and do a really quick interview with her, but over Thanksgiving when I saw her, I was incredibly mistaken. What I thought would be 30 minutes turned out to be a 4-hour-long discussion about my family history. I learned about the life of my great-grandparents, how Bawai almost died after a Viet Cong mortar round exploded outside of her home, how a fire in a government building in Saigon almost prevented her and my mom from reaching America. And these were just a few of the stories she told me. Talking over just cups of hot tea, we shared in her history and the stories and people in her life that would have experienced their second death if I hadn't asked. Of course, I also learned so much more about my grandfather, how he came to meet my Bawai, their relationship, and how they were ultimately forced to leave each other. It's the sort of thing you'd expect more from like movies or novels than your own family, but there I was, jaw agape, eyes wide, like a kid at a magic show. Before the conversation, I really thought I knew my Bawai, my grandma. She was just a tiny Vietnamese woman who laughed easily and would hug warmly. What I didn't realize, though, was that there was so much more to her. She wasn't just my Bawai, she was a person with her own stories and struggles unto herself. And by the end of our conversation, she was so much more than the woman who cooked me 2 greasy fried rice and watched The Price is Right with me. She was Man Ho, the woman from Can Tho, Vietnam, who lived a life filled with sadness and hope. And I think we take for granted a lot the things that our parents and our grandparents went through in order to give us the life that we have now. This is especially true for the sons and daughters of immigrants. After all, I'll never know that struggle of fleeing my country because of starvation and poverty. I'll never know the struggles of having to shave my head, otherwise Viet Cong soldiers might shoot me if they saw I had curly hair. I'll never know the struggle of setting sail on a dark and unforgiving ocean in a leaky boat with dozens of other people with no plan and direction. And I'll never know any of that struggle because my parents and grandparents have known it already. And as I continue my journey in unearthing my family tree, I know that I'll find out more and more things about my family that I never would have expected. Some of it will be sad, some of it will be so, so happy. And I'm going to go back to that wall sooner or later and hopefully find a way to climb it with the help of Liz, my family, and all my cousins I met along the way. But if I could give you one last piece of advice that has helped me the most in this journey, I'll say this: call your grandmother. Thank you.
You can either stand or you can sit.
Oh, I might just sit.
So I'll sort of start and on different sort of topical areas, and then we'll, actually, I probably should stand at the mic. So I'll start on different topical areas, and then as you have questions, I'll take them. We do have a microphone, so if you're wanting to ask a question, raise your hand, and Maeve will bring you the microphone. I first want to ask you to compare the different DNA testing companies. So you tested with 23andMe, you've tested with Ancestry DNA. And so if you give us some of your opinions or experience in terms of those different platforms and their utility and what you want to get out of them or what you wanted to get out of them, sort of how they stack up.
No, absolutely. I started initially with 23andMe, as I said before, and I found that service, I mean, it was incredibly helpful because it got me started on the first leg of my journey in order to trying to find my grandfather. That being said, though, I think when comparing it with Ancestry DNA, you can see that the utility of 23andMe is different. 23andMe is fantastic if you are looking for things more geared towards like health composition reports and stuff like that. However, Ancestry DNA provides a much more like, it's much more comprehensive if you're looking to build out your family tree. And they also have a larger database filled with users to connect to. So just by virtue of that, like you're going to be able to find more cousins through Ancestry DNA. At least that was the case for me. And yeah, going into, I mean, it just depends on what your goals are at the end of the day. That's one thing they always say to you, like whenever you're going into anything genealogy related, have a goal in mind. And so, I don't know, if your goal is to, yeah, if you want to really flesh out your family tree, try to connect with more relatives and cousins, I definitely suggest more towards Ancestry DNA.
How about composition of the database? So 23andMe has about 2 million users in their database. Ancestry has 5 million.
Yeah.
So is it compositionally different in terms of matching with cousins that are Asian ancestry versus matching with cousins of African American ancestry, European ancestry, or they're sort of different composition?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I found that composition-wise, I've actually found more family members on the East Asian side of me on 23andMe rather than Ancestry DNA. On Ancestry DNA, I found just a huge wealth of African American cousins, and I think that might be more by virtue of just, I don't want to generalize all Asian people, but like, yeah, like we are sort of like interested in like, oh, what are we looking for our health background, or like things of that nature. But yeah, I've definitely found that to be the case where, yeah, more, 23andMe is much more European, Asian, at least for me, and Ancestry DNA is a lot more African American cousins.
Any of the audience members have questions sort of contrasting the different services or information about the services? There's a question here. Get the microphone.
So I did 23andMe as well, and one thing that was a little disheartening for me was the absurd amount of people who went out of their way to tell me that it was bullshit and that I shouldn't put my money towards something like that. And as well as like my med school friends and my genetics friends, they all had really high opinions about it. Did you experience anything like that, and how did you respond to it?
There is an ethical question that comes up, isn't there? Because number one, you're at least voluntarily, like forfeiting your genetic DNA to a company, a private entity. And so that was a huge concern for me. I mean, just that came up, that people would raise, like, oh, what if we all of a sudden live in a dystopian Gattaca-esque future where one company has all genetic materials? Can cops go there and try to find people's genetic materials? Is that okay? That sort of thing. So I would run into a lot more ethical questions. I can't really speak to the idea that, oh, these tests aren't reliable, though. But I know that Brian can probably attest to this. There are tests out there that are just complete malarkey, though, or that you shouldn't trust. That being said, once you get something like 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, the bigger companies are going to be a lot more reliable for you. But there are a lot of weird knockoff ones. There's like Ancestry by DNA that will give you just a garbage test result back. And yeah, I mean, going into it, just do your research beforehand. But it's mostly safe if you stick to the big companies.
Don't do it.
No,
Just,
you
have to,
you don't
as
have
it
a choice.
gets recorded.
There are people at home and use it, otherwise there's no question, and he's just answering something.
just for interest,
Yeah.
where do you stand on Neanderthal percentage?
On what?
Neanderthals percentage.
Oh, I haven't actually. I'll be completely frank when I say that, like, I saw that on 23andMe. I was like, that's not relevant to me. I don't.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But for people who don't know, I mean, that's the percentage of, like, is it like just how many Neanderthals you're related to, or? Yeah, oh, yeah, see.
That was the top of
Yeah.
last Professor Drew Kitchen. It is available online if you would like to see it.
Yeah.
They haven't as yet done Denisovan DNA, as far as I know, which you'd have
Yeah.
more of as an East Asian.
But no, from what I understand with my
you
results.
would have some.
Yeah, I had
DNA.
some, but it wasn't a lot at all. It was
Oh.
like just a very minuscule amount.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just interested.
Good question.
Other questions sort of about the services or contrasting the different services?
I just had a comment. So, after Charlottesville, it was really interesting to see remarks and articles that were written about people who have had DNA tests, and they're white supremacists, and they're very surprised about their genetic makeup. So I think that, you're talking about when people go into getting their tests done,
Sure.
there can be great big surprises in it because you really don't know who your ancestors are
Yeah.
all the time.
That's one thing that that's one misconception that I had going into this would be like, people always tell you like, oh, I'm a quarter Czech and I'm like half Irish and et cetera, et cetera. But when you really break it down and you take those tests, I mean, like, those words are meaningless. I mean, because when you really break it down, you might be something completely different from what you thought you were. And I don't know, it's just infinitely fascinating to me. Yeah, it really changed my perspective on that whole sort of like where people think they're actually from.
I think, again, when you realize everyone's 100% African, that's what
Yeah.
really changes your mind.
Oh, there you go.
So you talked a bit about email exchanges, and you mentioned that the genealogy community being kind. Is that a distinction between 23andMe and Ancestry DNA in terms of the responsiveness of matches in those two platforms and their ability to provide information that was helpful in your motivations?
Oh yeah, no, that's a good question because that is a big distinction between Ancestry DNA and 23andMe that I found. The people who are on Ancestry DNA tend to be a lot more gung-ho when it comes to ancestry research and genealogy. By virtue of that fact, they're going to be a lot more like responsive to you when you do message them. That's just the platform Ancestry DNA is, though. They provide you with a huge, massive resource to draw upon. You can look through census records going back to like 1840, I believe, 1850, 1840, and yeah, birth records, death records, like everything's there for you. So you're going to find a lot less casuals going about their ancestry research and people who are a lot more willing to engage with you.
So I don't want this meeting to be a platform for any particular company.
Oh, yeah.
So have you put your data in family tree DNA and their family
Yes, I
finder
actually
too?
did.
Because
Yeah.
they're also that community is also very responsive as well.
Yeah, that's also, well, that community, you can tell just by looking at these different sites, like how responsive they're going to be. Like for Family Tree DNA, for example, like you have to provide your email address, and like you can see the person's email address like right away. With a service like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, you have to use their own internal messaging system, so you can't directly contact them, but you can contact them through the site. But yeah, once you get into services like Family Tree DNA, you're going to find a lot more serious people.
So I was wondering, like, I've tested for a few different companies, and some of the results are very different. So, like, one test will say I'm like 23% Greek or something, and another test doesn't even mention it. So I'm just wondering, like, what should I believe?
The thing, now I can't completely speak to this because I mean, I'm not a genetic biologist by any means.
So you give it from your perspective, and I'll give a follow-up.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, these are all estimates. Like, they're not going to give you, like, 100% accurate, like, oh, here, you're from, like, you have family from Greece. It's an estimated range. My family, like, we know for certain, we've lived for, like many generations in Vietnam, but like both the tests will tell me that I'm East Asian, primarily Chinese. It's just an estimate at the end of the day. Just telling you like, okay, here's where most people with your genetic makeup line up. Like here's where they are on the map. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a question of like, who should I believe, who's the most accurate, but you just got to go into it remembering that, like, oh, it is just an estimation at the end of the day.
So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'll do a follow-up to yours. And so,
Yeah.
you said you came out with 23andMe as being 10% European. So European is then broken down into countries as they now exist in their current borders. Is that 10% European broken down into countries very different if you look at 23andMe versus if you look at Ancestry DNA, which would be somewhat related to this question here?
Oh, no, absolutely. And it is broken down like very differently once you go into the Northern Europe countries. Because Northern Europe, you got like Britain and Ireland. Those are the two ones that I matched up with. I believe on 23andMe, they got me like 7% British and like 3% Irish, and Ancestry DNA is the flip-flop of that. So it's just like, yeah, it's just an estimate at the end of the day. I don't put too much stock into it, but it's neat to know, like vaguely European.
So to sort of follow up on your question, if you're an individual that maybe is 99% European ancestry, they then break that down into fine-scale current political boundaries. The reality is you're European and you're some mix of your history of your ancestors throughout Europe. The reality is, currently across Europe, there's not much genetic difference across different European nations. And so the ability to detect sort of where you may be weighted in your ancestry from one European country to the next, there's some error in that estimation. And as Tony said, it's an estimate. Which particular references or which particular reference countries or how they're identifying them can be different by the different companies. And so they may lump Ireland with England, and so they may treat them separately, and so that's going to be a difference in terms of that interpretation. So there's a variety of different things that come in, especially if you're mostly European in your ancestry and trying to then discriminate that down. And that geographically is sort of the finest scale that each of these companies try to discriminate individuals is sort of across Europe. And the reality is Europe is pretty homogeneous genetically. If you're an individual of mixed race ancestry, they're actually going to be the most accurate in terms of, 20% Asian, and that's going to be fairly uniform. Because that's big categorization across geographic variation. Contrasting Europe with Africa with Asia, that's sort of the big three distinction of human genetic variation due to the patterns of migration historically in human populations. So here I have a question in front.
So this seems to be that just Ancestry has one construct and 23andMe has another one, and it's just their people, their DNA specialists sort of deciding, oh, this should be German or this should be Irish or what. It seems like in GEDmatch, aren't there over 100 different constructs of, I mean, that's such a complicated program. I don't understand half of it, but it seems like there's one that if you're Asian, then they'll tell you what different, just the way we've nitpicked Europe.
This is another piece of that answer to that question in terms of why the different companies are different or why are given a different interpretation, because they have to decide on what particular algorithm, what method they're going to use in making that prediction. And there's various ways you can do that. As scientists understanding human genetic variation, these methods have been developed, and a variety of different methods for understanding the distribution of human genetic variation among current humans. There's a variety of different approaches that have been developed, and so the scientists at 23andMe decide on an approach that hopefully satisfies this broad customer base. The scientists at Ancestry DNA decide on an approach, and hopefully an approach that sort of satisfies that customer database. But they use different approaches at their essence in terms of the science that they're applying to make that ancestry composition.
Two questions come out of this. One is from the DNA, from the GED match, with all the different, it seems like McAllister could make up a design, and then somebody else makes up oh, you're 34, because you're going to come out different depending on who does it.
Correct. You
And-
can make it more fine-scaled, and the companies are developing something that's generally applicable for someone of any ancestry and how to interpret that. And so, yes, you can, as a scientist, if I were to go out and sample people, I could make something very fine-grained. I can make something very coarse-grained. What the companies are doing is trying to develop a platform that's applicable to anybody of any particular ancestry and give them some estimate of what that long-term ancestry is.
And it's interesting to see on YouTube the black people talking about their DNA results, because they get totally different results depending on who,
Africa is poorly sampled, and Africa as a continent has the greatest amount of genetic variation of any continent that humans are present on, because modern humans arose in Africa. There's huge amounts of genetic variation in Africa, and these companies are only sampling a couple of different places in Africa. But we need to move on beyond this.
That lady was on Ancestry, that when she talked to us a couple years ago, she said their African was getting better because they got more details in West Africa, so their results are better.
They will improve as they get better and better references to compare people to.
Yeah, that's one nice thing about these companies, is that the more people buy into them and the more people who use them, the bigger their database gets and the more samples they're able to draw upon.
Well, and to follow up on her question, sort of so within your African ancestry, how does that compare in terms of what regions that they're predicting in terms of your African-American ancestry?
They actually are both pretty much on the level with each other, mostly out of West Africa, the Ivory Coast, Senegal, that area. But it's not any more like specific than that, just generally the West Africa area.
I have one question in the back, and then we have one in the front.
Well, this is a really quick one. And working?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. You mentioned that Ancestry.com helped you, was better because of finding material that you could use that was helpful, like census and other kinds of birth and death records.
Mm-hmm.
And is that only true for the United States, or is that European and other countries too?
It is mostly a United States-based database, if I'm not mistaken. I have not tried to look any more further than that. And to be completely honest, I haven't tried to find birth records or any sort of things like that in Vietnam either, because it seemed as though like they didn't really keep that sort of thing when my parents were coming up. Like if a kid was born, they just sort of told everyone that was it. There was no such thing as like a birth certificate for them or anything.
The other thing is that considering the upheavals of the world wars, for
Yeah.
example, one wonders how much of that information has been lost irretrievably because of destruction of.
Well, I know for sure after the fall of Saigon that there was a lot of records like that, just government records that were lost in just various fires and just sort of the chaos that was occurring immediately following the war. So yeah, in terms of at least my East Asian ancestry, there's no real records that I can follow. I believe that Ancestry DNA does provide records in Europe to a certain extent though, but it's not as intensive as the American records. Correct me if I'm wrong, anyone though.
That's correct.
Yeah.
It takes a different subscription.
Oh yeah, that's right.
A pricier one. We had a question in the front.
Ancestry does have a good European component to it because of, the massive church records. I think that's really how people can trace their ancestry. I'm a librarian, so. But I don't know, we haven't really dealt with people doing work in Asia. And I don't know about those records, but, I mean, church records are incredibly valuable.
I've had a few students in my group that have tried some Asian stuff, and there's not a lot of information that they've been able to find.
But, you know, you have to trust that the person wrote down who the father was correctly. So, there you go.
Okay, my question is, given that these services are based on the size of the database, and it becomes more accurate as more people use it, do your own personalized results update as more people add to it, or?
I haven't seen any updates quite of yet, but I only relatively very recently done this. I mean, this whole...
Has your DNA relative list changed?
Oh yeah, my DNA relative list has updated. Like I'm getting new cousins like every day, but they typically tend to be like third or fourth cousin sort of range. Yeah. Yeah.
So as any new person comes in the database, if you're in there and you're a cousin of them, they will be listed in your relative list. And so that's something that automatically updates every day, that relative list. Okay.
So these companies obviously, are selling a product, and I would assume more specific information could lead to, better user engagement and things like that. And then, especially when you have multiple companies competing, I guess my question would be, how satisfied are you with the company's transparency, with how good the estimates are, how accurate they are, just the methods and statistical analysis they use to calculate those things? Do you think that they're being pretty honest and pretty upfront to their customers about how much of an estimate it is or how much it isn't in certain situations?
As of now, the only thing that caused me concern when I went into this whole process was an article that I read about how 23andMe were about to, or were at least debating, providing genetic information to law enforcement. And that was something that gave me pause. Obviously, if I'm gonna, forfeit over my genetic material, I'd like them to keep it safe and just keep it private above all else. And they're always very clear with you, whether you're an Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA, 23andMe. At the beginning, they're like, we won't sell your genetic material to anyone else. It's gonna be it's a very private thing. It's just gonna be between you and whoever else you choose to share it with. So as of now, I'm tentatively satisfied with the way the process has gone so far. And in terms of transparency, at least all the organizations that I've used thus far have been pretty good about being open and transparent about just their processes, like what happens with my genetic material once it leaves my house, and essentially what they do with it. And the nice thing is you can always opt out of an option with these things. Like with 23andMe, you can choose not to receive a health composition thing. You can choose not to submit it into their health reports, so they won't have it in a certain database of theirs. And you can also choose to not receive the relative finder tool at all. You can choose not to have your cousins find you. They give you a lot of control, so that feels good. And haven't found any reason to give me pause yet.
So I'll follow up that question just a little bit. So each of these services has a really, really long terms of service that as it currently exists. Any company can change their terms of service at any time. And so that's something that if you're concerned about what they are, the terms of service is where you find what they're going to do. Each of these companies has a research component. Ancestry DNA has the largest database of individuals' DNAs that exist. There's power in that. They do research on that. You can opt to participate in their research program, and if in their research program, if they want to collaborate with a pharmaceutical company, they can. And you can consent to participate in that research. You can opt out. And so there's a research element to each one of these companies you can either opt into or opt out of. And these are things as a user you should be aware of and be cognizant of in terms of making your decisions about how you do want to participate. And as Tony elegantly pointed out, 23andMe has a lot of options, and you can opt out of those different options in terms of the services they offer. Ancestry DNA, their goal is to match you with cousins. You know, if you want to opt out of that, don't do the test. That's what they want to do. And so you're basically opting in by doing the test.
Given the current age of the military personnel that were in Vietnam, they're aging out. I'm really surprised that there's not an organization of U.S. soldiers looking for children that they know they left in Vietnam. I'm just surprised there's not a group doing that.
There are actually massive, or not massive by any means, but there is a small community of people who dedicate themselves to doing exactly that. Unfortunately, I mean, a lot of it is just up to me at the end of the day. I mean, they can only do so much for me. I have to be the one who's like, okay, taking the genetic tests, doing my own sort of legwork and stuff like that. But and most of these organizations, I mean, they work completely pro bono, just a community of people just helping each other out. But I am involved with a lot of them. There's a lot of Facebook groups, even like Google Plus groups, and I'm involved with a lot of them. I put my information out there, and those people are also extremely helpful. Because, I mean, it's filled with soldiers who are looking for their children, and they want to find their children like as much as their children probably want to find them. And so it's a good place to find like-minded individuals, like, you know, bounce ideas off each other, get ideas, tips, that sort of thing. But so far, I haven't been able to find any leads from it at all. But yeah, so it does exist.
In the turquoise shirt.
Go ahead.
In the turquoise shirt.
The turquoise.
Oh, okay. I was wondering, I actually did MyHeritage, but I haven't heard you speak anything about that.
Oh,
Did
sure.
you try MyHeritage
I
at
haven't.
all?
It's on my list. That's
okay.
Yeah, I was actually going to try to get it within the month. And,
Oh, okay.
yeah, hopefully
And
get
so
this
are
in.
you able to, if I want to put my MyHeritage results into Ancestry, can I do that? Or do you know?
No. What you
cannot?
can do, though,
Okay.
there is a third-party service that they offer called GEDmatch. I believe you mentioned it, where you can upload your Ancestry composition reports, just the raw data, and you just upload it into GEDmatch. And from GEDmatch, they compare it to everyone else who puts their information into GEDmatch, and they can match you with cousins there. And they'll even provide you like information like, oh, how many like SNPs is it called?
It's a very do-it-yourself
Yeah.
website. So there's a lot of tools there, and they essentially accept the raw data from any of these DNA testing companies I mentioned. Their numbers of users is around 300,000, 400,000 or
Yeah,
something
it's
like
pretty
that.
small,
And so it's
relatively.
it's a very active community, but it's not a large community. So you're much more likely to have distant relatives there, but they would likely be really active individuals.
Yeah.
And so they'll respond to those emails. Then we had a question over here.
I actually had one more question though. But the percentage, like I'll get matches and they do say like, 0.7%, or I've had some that are like 1.0 or 2.0% of a relative match. So what do you say to that? Do they do that in Ancestry too, or 23andMe?
Oh,
Do
yes,
they
they'll
give you a
give you-
percentage?
yeah,
and
they'll give you a
so
relative.
is that a decent amount? Do I want to
Yeah, an estimate like that.
click on that and say I want to match with you and see if you're
One,
enough of
one
a
thing that I would
relative?
suggest is not pursuing any leads in regards to fourth to distant cousin matches, because in those cases you're going to have to go back like a lot of generations. It gets into the 3 digits, how many people you're going to have to sift through in order to find a common ancestor. So if you can, like, try to find a match that's more like second cousin, third cousin if you don't have that. But yeah, second cousin and up. I mean, that's the ideal, easiest way to find like who you're related to, who's your most common ancestor. Oh gosh, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I have it like somewhere on my computer, but yeah.
So one more question, do you think? Okay.
Yeah, is Ancestry.com the same as Ancestry DNA?
Excuse me, one more time?
Is Ancestry.com the same as Ancestry DNA?
Yes, correct. They're the exact same service.
Okay. Anyway, what I was going to say was, do you have any experience with when they they say someone's Jewish. My husband has quite a bit of Jewish ancestry, but he really was looking for whether or not he was more Czech or more Hungarian, because he has, as far as he knows, that was what he was interested in. But they just said, so much percentage Jewish, which didn't take him very far. Now, whether he hasn't maybe gone far enough, but do you have any experience with that?
So again, I mean, Czech, Hungarian, that's sort of a level at which I don't know if any of the companies sort of break down Europe sort of to that scale. Because the reality is that you're talking about a region that was sort of central to the migrations through Europe, and so you don't have sort of the genetic distinction between current individuals in Czechoslovakia, current individuals in Hungary, in terms of that fine scale parsing out of differences between individuals of those ancestry. So you're sort of Eastern European in terms of that distinction.
Hungarians have got a different background, the Turks and all the rest
Right,
of it.
but the
Anyway.
ability to parse that out would take very fine-scaled studies within those regions. These overall estimates are for any consumer of any ancestry, and so they're not going to focus on making that distinction within that sort of narrow geographic region. Okay, and so I thank you for your attention. Thank Tony Tran for participating in that.